So I recently picked up this Orient Polaris, which is a automatic watch that has a power reserve in it along with the GMT complication. This is the first watch that I've gotten that has a power reserve in it. And I've been having a lot of fun playing around with that. It's been really interesting to be able to see and look down and see exactly how much power is left in my watch. And I think I always kind of wondered with mechanical watches, like how much you need to wind them. And I was a little bit hesitant about that. So having a power reserve was a really useful feature to me. And I think it really helped me understand more kind of what was going on behind the scenes. So I wanted to do a quick video to kind of talk about how much you need to wind a watch, what the basics are of that. And then I kind of did a couple of experiments with some of my watches from what I've sort of learned to sort of test it out and see how it worked in real world circumstances. So first, a couple of basics that I've kind of done some research on. When it comes to winding watches, obviously there's two kinds of watches that you have. You're going to have either your automatic mechanical watch or hand-wound mechanical watch, and they work differently when it comes to winding. So with a hand-wound watch, basically you're going to wind that as much as you can. There will be a point when you will not be able to wind it anymore, and probably you want to stop before you get to that point a little bit. You don't want to force it or damage it, but usually the winding mechanism should be pretty robust on a hand-wound watch. And obviously you want to get as much power into it as possible because it's going to unwind and let itself go. And you know, the more power you put into it, the longer it'll be before you have to wind it again, and the less chance there is of it running out without you realizing it. Automatic mechanical watches are a little bit different. They're designed so that basically you can't overwind them. The rotor in an automatic watch needs to be able to spin freely even after the watch is wound, and so because of that, once the spring has reached its maximum tension, if you continue to wind it or if the rotor continues to spin, the spring will just kind of turn within its little compartment. So this obviously makes it much harder to tell when the watch is fully wound because you can just keep spinning the crown basically forever and it will continue to spin. So I don't have any hand-wound watches. I've only got automatic ones. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be kind of testing with some of my automatic watches to sort of try and answer two questions. And the two things I wanted to look at is, one, what's the minimum amount you need to wind your watch? And this is, I think, is especially helpful to realize when it comes to watches that don't have a hand winding. So a lot of the Seiko 5 series watches, some of the older Orients, if you don't have hand winding, you can usually only you're usually not going to shake it until it reaches full power because that would take forever. And I had a Seiko 5 before, and I was always kind of concerned. It's like, well, if I shake it for 30 seconds, is that long enough? Is it going to be, is it going to run out of, power before I start using it? So first question is, what's kind of the minimum you need to wind the watch for it to kind of kick in, and so that the automatic part of the mechanical movement will power it for the rest of the day. And then the second one is how long do you have to wind your watch to get it to reach full power? So one of the first kind of experiments that I did with my Orient Polaris was I wanted to try and wind it up to maybe about 5 hours of power reserve and then see what would happen after that, if that was going to be enough for the automatic movement to kind of take over and charge it up. So I did that. I wound it up to 5 hours, and it took about 7 turns to get it to 5 hours. So that was one thing I wanted to count. And by the end of the day, it had, easily by the end of the day, it had gotten all the way up to 40 hours and gotten to full power reserve. So the next thing I want to do now is I'm going to take this Guanqin, which has a Seiko NH36 movement in it. So pretty common movement, and you've probably got some, a lot of you guys probably got some watches that have the same movement in it. So this will probably be a helpful baseline. I'm going to do the same thing this one. This one doesn't have a power reserve, so I won't be able to tell how it's running. But I'm going to go ahead and give this one about 7 turns on the crown, and then I'll wear it for the day, and we'll see how it goes, see if it charges up. And so then after that, I'll let it wind down, and we'll kind of measure how long it takes before it gets, before it runs out of power. So it's about 9:35 a.m. right now when I'm doing this. So I'll set the watch and I'll go out and wear it, and we'll check back at the end of the day and then mark it again. Okay, so I've worn the watch all day long, and it's now 8:20 p.m. when I'm going to take it off my wrist, and this is again on the 10th when I'm doing this. So we'll see how long it takes until the watch stops. I'll go ahead and set it down. I won't touch it again, and then I'll check on it every once in a while and see how it's going, and we'll see how much power I was able to put into this watch. Again, starting with 7 cranks of the crown, and then wearing it for a day, and then we'll see how long it lasts for. And then as sort of a control to kind of make sure that I'm getting the full power, I have another watch. This one has this is a William Greger. It's got a Seiko NH35. So I'm guessing the power reserve is going to be basically the same on it. For this one, I'm just going to wind it for a long time until I'm absolutely sure that this thing is got its full power in. And this is going to test two things. One, it's going to show that you can't really overwind it. Now, I suspect this is probably putting more stress on the movement than you probably should, and you probably shouldn't wind it this much on a regular basis, but I'm assuming this isn't going to really hurt it too much because it's not supposed to. So I'm just going to keep winding it and winding it and winding it until I'm absolutely sure, and then I'll set this one and I'll set it down as well, and we'll see if it runs for around the same time as the Guanqin. All right, so it's been a couple days and I've had these guys just sitting on my desk without me touching them, and they ran out around the same time. You can see as I got them out of my case, I kind of budged the William Greger a little bit and it started moving again, so I accidentally gave a little bit of power. But they were stopped before I took them out of the case, so I could tell. So it looks like the Guanqin ran for, if I'm doing my math right here, about 44 and a half hours roughly. So it went from 8:20 a.m. on the 10th, and then it didn't stop until about 5 p.m. on the 12th. So a little bit over, just about 2 days later. And again, the Guanqin is the one that I wound it about 7 times and then just wore it for the rest of the day. And so it got up to its full power for sure by the end of the day, just by wearing the watch under normal usage. The William Greger, I'm assuming that the movement just has a little bit slightly larger power reserve than the Guanqin does. So it's a 36A versus a 35. So the William Greger had maybe an extra half hour of power reserve in it. I'm guessing there's a slight difference between the two movements. Maybe with the NH36A having a day-date complication that takes slightly more power to power that, and maybe that would account for the William Greger having a little bit larger power reserve, because that one's running an NH35 without the day complication. But most likely it's just a slight difference in the manufacturing of the two movements. But either way, this does go to show that even if you do just put a small amount of power into your watch at the beginning of the day, probably under normal usage, that's going to charge it up to full power by the end of the day of you wearing it. Again, I was wearing it for about 11 hours the first day. And yeah, by the end of the day, we had gotten up to over 40 hours of power reserve in the watch. So finally, the last kind of thing I want to take a look at, let's just say about how many turns do you have to wind a watch that's an automatic watch to get it to full power? So if you don't want to just wind it for a long time like I did with the William Greger, what's a pretty safe one to do? I'm just going to go ahead and take my Orient Polaris back out with its power reserve, and I'm going to wind it up to full power and see how many turns it takes. All right, so that took just about 30 turns of the crown to get it up. So I would say that if you got an automatic watch, especially if you're winding at the beginning of the day, probably 30 turns is going to be enough to give you enough power to get through the day. And I've heard it said that that your watch should be above half power reserve to be the most accurate. So that's really probably the safest one would be if it's something that you're going to wear it for the rest of the day. Just put enough power in it to get it roughly over half, so maybe 15-20 turns, and you should be totally fine. If you want to get it all the way up, do around 30 turns, and I'm guessing that's going to be probably similar across these watches that all have it's 40-hour power reserve is pretty common, so I'm guessing the ratio will be roughly the same. But again, with automatic watches, it's not something that you can really screw up that much, and you don't really need to worry about. But it's interesting to see and kind of see how the power reserve works and to see how efficient these things are. And I think that's the kind of thing that, again, if I was working with like a Seiko 5 where it didn't have the hand winding, maybe that's not as big a deal as I thought it was. Maybe just that giving that little 30 seconds with the Seiko Shuffle will put 5 or 6 hours of power reserve into it, and yeah, you'd be totally good to go for the rest of the day. So yeah, that'll wrap it up for today. Hope this was interesting to you guys. Let me know what you think, if I'm totally messing anything up, if you think this is off. But anyways, I'll see you guys next time.